Exactly. Contentment, though, what I've noticed, the one thing that hasn't changed in the last 50 years for me is contentment. It was a battle when I was 20. It's a battle when I'm 70. Why is it that we have so much trouble getting more content?
I think we're probably looking for somebody else to make us content, not realizing we've got to do it to ourselves. We've got to do it in our heart to be content with what we've got. Because there's always somebody out there that's got more or seems to be better. You know, oh, he's got a new boat, he's got a new car, you know, that type of stuff.
I think one thing that's interesting is I think God knows that you're not content. Because he's the one that said, don't covet. Contented people don't covet. Would you buy that? Contented people don't covet. They don't do just what you're talking about. Okay? Yes?
I think it also has to do with our circumstances, whatever they are in that time, you know, whatever it is. I'm not content because this and that. You look at our circumstances.
Yes.
Whatever it is.
Circumstances.
They change.
Yeah, circumstances get better, they get worse.
Right.
Right? You know, I've quoted Job a million times. God gives, God takes away. You know, that's kind of Job's perspective on this idea of what you have or what you don't have. All that. So, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 7. The interesting thing about 1 Corinthians 7, in the context of it, it's written addressing questions of marriage that the Corinthians had. Paul starts off his chapter, he says, concerning about the things which you wrote. That's a clue that the Corinthians had communicated with Paul, and one of the things they had questions about was marriage. Here's the deal. As I look around the room today, I doubt that any of you have big questions about marriage. Well, most of us are at the stage of life where whatever that issue is, it's kind of settled. But I'm going to put out another phrase to you. Have you ever heard this? Accept your lot in life. Accept your lot in life. Paul believes that we should accept our lot in life. In 1 Corinthians 7, we're going to pick it up in verse 17, and I'm going to read from there. But what we're going to see is he's going to use a phrase 3 times. Remain in that situation you were when God called you. That's his way of saying, accept your lot in life. Read with me in verse 17. Now, the first 16 verses that we're not going to read is really, he's addressing marriage and all the issues around it. And so, that really is not what we're looking for from this chapter today. We're not really trying to solve issues directly with marriage. However, I would say, most of you would agree, marriage is one of the biggest decisions any of us can make. Right? It has some of the biggest consequences. So, verse 17, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you and remain as you were when God first called you. This is my rule for all the churches. For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it. And the man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now. For it makes no difference whether or not a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments. Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you, but if you get a chance to be free, take it. And remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. And if you were free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave of Christ. God has paid a high price for you, so don't be enslaved by the world. Each of you, dear brothers, should remain as you were when God first called you. So what we see here in verse 17, in verse 20, and then in verse 24, each of you should remain as you were when God first called you. Is that not the same thing as Paul saying, accept your lot in life? What makes this so significant, though, is we're going to look at this. He highlights 3 different categories of life. And this is where the application starts kicking in for us. The first category has to do with the person's relationship with the Lord, so to speak, with circumcision. Now, circumcision is not a huge deal in our culture anymore, but you got to keep in mind, back when he's talking about this, it was what separated the Jews from the rest of the universe. It was a covenant that had been in place by this time till Christ came, from the time of Abraham, which is about 2400 BC, all the way up to the time of Christ, right? So this has been around for 2400 years, and now Paul's saying, you know what? It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Okay? Then the next category that Paul deals with is slavery. Well, we are not slaves, technically speaking, but let's figure out how that applies to us. You know what the first thing you need to know about a slave is? He had no way to make money. Because a slave, by definition, is someone who labors for free for others. True? So if you think about slavery, it has to do with economic status. It has to do with what is your economic status in life. Can you labor for yourself, work more and make more? Or are you basically an impoverished debtor where you work for somebody else and you get nothing? So we have circumcision that has to do with our vertical relationship with God. We have slavery, which has to do with our economic status in the world. But then the first thing that led up to all this is the question of marriage. And he says, basically, you should remain in that situation in which you are called. Now, to summarize those first 16 verses, Paul talks about basically the big thorny question to them was being married to an unbeliever. What should you do if you're married to an unbeliever? Should you divorce him or not? And what Paul tells these believers who might be married to unbelievers is this: it's not your decision to make. If the unbeliever chooses to stay with you, you accept that. If the unbeliever chooses to leave you, you accept that. Paul basically says, okay, you people who are in mixed marriages, it's not up to you to change your status. Accept your lot in life that you were when God called you. Follow me? So he looks at the biggest decision of life, which is marriage. He looks at one of the biggest decisions spiritually, which is circumcision. He looks at one of the biggest decisions economically, which is slavery. And in all of these things, 3 times he says, stay the way you were when God called you. But then he puts this little caveat to the slaves. He says, well, if you can gain your freedom, do it, but otherwise don't worry about that. Think about the impact of that, if you will. Telling a slave, look, it's no big deal. If whatever, flip a coin. Heads you get free, tails you stay a slave. Can you imagine telling a slave that? Let's look at the mixed marriage. You're the believer, you're married to an unbeliever. Okay? Let's look at what that might mean if you were a Corinthian. Corinthians, in the Corinthian culture, in the city of Corinth, there's a saying that when you read the history books, that they would sometimes use to describe a loose female. And that saying was, oh, she's a Corinthian girl. Now, if you were a sailor that sailed into Corinth and you were looking for a good time, you knew you were going to find easy pickings in Corinth with Corinthian girls. When you take that kind of philosophy and you bring it into a marriage with a Christian, how do you think that sits? Probably didn't go over well. So Paul is looking at these people who might be in mixed marriages, and it could be the man or the woman, it doesn't matter. But what we need to understand is this: the marriage commitment and do not commit adultery was not a big deal in Corinth. That's the ramifications of what he's saying to these people. That if you're in this marriage that may not be that great, it's not up to you, believer, to decide to dissolve it. It's up to that unbeliever to decide if they want to stay or if they want to leave. Okay, you slave, it's not up to your master to decide it's not up to you to decide about your freedom. If your master sets you free, take it. You're not under obligations to stay. But if your master puts his thumb down and says, you're going to die as my slave, okay, slave, you got to accept that. Think about how that goes over. Think about telling a 20-year-old slave, accept your lot in life. Think about that. Think about being married to an unbeliever, okay? And you have children, and you're trying to bring them up the way the Lord wants you to. And that unbeliever is sitting over there getting drunk with a bottle of whiskey or cheating on you. And Paul goes to that believer and says, it's not up to you to leave this marriage. It's up to that unbeliever to decide if they want to stay or not. And finally, let's bring some focus to this idea of circumcision. What's he trying to say there? Here's what that means to us. Every person in this room has a spiritual gift. Okay? What that means to us is God has given you a gift, and it's up to you to recognize it and accept it. In other words, the total picture is this. When God saved you, all these categories of life that we're talking about, they're fixed. And it's up to you to accept your lot in life with all that that means. To me, in the battle of contentment, that's kind of a hard pill to swallow. Would you agree?
Yes.
That's kind of a hard pill to swallow. But yet, Paul highlights these three most significant areas of our lives. Our spiritual condition that's fixed, our marital condition, our financial condition. And Paul says, accept your lot in life. Not good news, is it? Because this whole idea of contentment is driven by the idea that we want to improve our life, not accept our life. The whole idea of contentment or discontentment is this idea that I want to improve my life by doing this, acquiring that, whatever it may be. Now we're going to look at a couple of guys who struggled with contentment. I've referred to them a million times, so I'm going to ask your forgiveness if you say, Jimmy, I've heard this before. We're going to look at it through a little bit different lens, a little different perspective. We're going to look at Paul and Job and their struggle for contentment. Because, Bob, since you said you were content, I'm going to pick on you.
Okay.
Did you have to learn to be content?
I think so.
How did you learn contentment?
Just living life. Just,
That's kind of vague.
it's kind of, well, I mean, your daily trials, you can learn to, hey, live with them. Just living life, I think it's that simple.
Okay. So this 20-year-old that says, how shall I be content? You're going to tell him, just live life.
Well, maybe I might tell you to live a good Christian life, but,
Okay.
I mean, you can't know what's wrong until you've committed it and found out the hard way that it's wrong and you won't do it again.
Okay. Trial and error.
There you go.
Trial and error. Okay. Pam, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just thinking back, I've said this before, but I look back at my family and the people that I knew. I was around a lot of my grandparents a lot and all the people. I don't remember, of course my brain, you know what it is now, but I don't remember them saying, oh, I wish I'd done this or I wish I did. They sort of, as he said, lived life. I don't remember them saying, oh, we didn't do this, and you didn't do that. I don't remember that. They just sort of lived it. And I just watched them, but they didn't seem discontented. Maybe they were, but they didn't show it. So I don't know what that means, other than I think one thing our society shows us and teaches us to be discontent.
Okay.
That's all I got.
Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I think in 2 Corinthians, doesn't it say choose joy?
2 Corinthians what?
I think 8 or 9, it says choose joy, and that's part of,
Okay,
that I'm sure of the 20-year-old, but I don't know that they would understand that.
right, right,
But that's a commandment,
right. Okay.
I think.
I would say contentment, go ahead.
I don't look at contentment as in conjunction with materialism.
Okay,
Yeah, I
And
agree.
so that's a separate thing, although I understand that they can be wedded. I
right,
see it very differently, and I see that it's a God-given thing for us to want to, for self-betterment. The scripture is full of admonition to not compare ourselves to somebody else, but to strive to be better with whatever we're doing in God's, between us and God. And against ourselves, not against somebody else.
okay. Dave?
It's kind of like having goals,
Right,
right?
having
In
goals,
other
yeah.
words, when you're first married, we lived in a single wide, and we did plan on somewhere down the road in our lives, future lives, of building a home. So that was a goal of ours.
Yeah.
We were able to attain it, but I mean, still, it's just a goal, so
Mhm.
what's the difference between a goal and a commitment?
Right.
Or contentment.
Yeah. We'll kind of speak to what you just said. Paul did tell the slave, if you can gain your freedom, do it. Okay, so he doesn't close the door on improvement. He doesn't close the door on improvement. What he's trying to do is to give you a perspective. Because here's the deal. Contentment really has to do with two ideas: expectations and perspective. Expectations, what do you expect life to be? And perspective, how do you see it? Okay?
You know, Jim, it's like you mentioned before, when you're 20 years old, your perspective of what will make you content is entirely different than when you're 70 years old.
That's true.
How you see it changes, but you still want what you want.
Comfort.
To an extent, but you also know what you can do.
Yeah,
I think you've learned where it comes from.
you learn where
as you
it
get
comes
up
from.
older.
Right,
What you wanted at 20, you thought it was gonna, then as you live your, I'm just speaking personally, and I don't know this, but it's what you see, oh, I'm da-da-da-da-da, and then you get and you think, well, I'm really not content even though I have all that, whatever it is. It could be circumstance and or materialism, but you see, that's not where it comes from, at
Right.
least for me.
right. Let's look at Paul's battle for contentment that he outlines in Philippians 4. Philippians 4, and we will start with verse 10. A familiar phrase, but this is Paul's battle for contentment. Philippians 4:10. How I praise the Lord that you are concerned about me again. I know you've always been concerned for me, but you didn't have the chance to help me. Not that I was ever in need, for I've learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. So we see Paul here, and this would be the economic thing from 1 Corinthians 7, the slave thing. He's talking about material needs, physical needs, and he talks about, I've had it really good and I've had it really bad, okay? But here's the deal. He talks about a secret. He says, I've learned the secret of living in every situation. My question is, what's the secret?
An attitude of gratefulness.
Okay, attitude, okay? What else?
One of the things I notice more now is that my younger people in my family, oh my goodness, they just work so hard and seem to not get anywhere, or kids are sick or whatever. And my thing for them, and one of them told me it's the right thing to say, all things pass. You'll be patient, work at it. You don't have to be crazy. It will really pass most of the time. It may not pass to what you want, but it'll change.
Okay. Yes.
Perseverance.
Pardon?
Perseverance.
Say again, please.
Perseverance.
Yeah, perseverance. Okay. Okay. He says, I've learned the secret, okay, whether it's this or whether it's that. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. If I see a secret in here, I call it the secret of dependency. I can do it through Christ who gives me strength. He didn't say Christ who gives me the $1 million, because he just talked about good and bad, right? So he's saying God does not give me the $1 million, but God gives me the ability. God does not give me the $1 million because he said, I've had it this way, I've had it this way. But he did say God gave me something. He says God gave me strength. Think of it this way. You remember the rich fool in the Gospels? The man who had the productive land, and he said, I don't have any more room to store my crops. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Remember the story? And that night he died. Okay? What was Jesus trying to teach there? That this man saw material wealth as security, but that security was ultimately an illusion. True? The underlying theme with money is we live with it on two levels. We live with it on the practical level, which is I need $150 more this month because my electric bill went up. But we also live with it on the emotional level. The rich fool saw money on the emotional level. Before, he didn't have to build bigger barns because he already had enough, right? Okay? But when he built the bigger barns, he said, now I can kick back and take it easy. In other words, all the bases are covered. I am secure. For him, money offered the illusion of security. Jesus tried to tell him that parable. That's not reality. That's not real life. Death can happen at any time. What am I trying to convey here? That part of the problem with contentment with money is I've got to figure out what it means to me emotionally. I've learned that most of us can be divided into two groups. The security money people and the acquiring people. The acquiring money people are the ones who always want more. The security money people are kind of like me. We're always worried about running out. We're okay driving that old jalopy. We're just worried if we're going to have enough for tomorrow. However, my neighbor, he's not worried about having enough for tomorrow because he's out there buying the Lamborghini today. He's just got to have the Lamborghini or he's not going to be happy. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's strictly an emotional thing. And I've learned the better part of wisdom is I have to look in the mirror and figure out my emotional relationship to dollar bills. What do those dollar bills mean to me in the way that I feel? Not just the external world of paying the electric bill. So what's Paul trying to say here in this? I've learned the secret is this. He says, I peeled it back and I've realized something. That depending upon God is the ultimate security, not the extra money in the bank. He says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Let's rephrase that. I can do whatever God leads me to because God will get me through it. Would you buy that that's really saying the same thing? So in other words, his secret to money was realizing that God is my adequacy, not the dollar bills. God is my sufficiency, not the dollar bills. As opposed to that rich fool who thought if I just have enough barns, I'll have the ultimate security. Just as a side note, because I've talked about the people who look at money as security. Let's look at the other side of the coin. The people who look at money and they just got to have that new $200 pair of shoes. Okay? Let's look at them.
Seriously, you didn't need to use that one.
Let's look at those people, because I'm going to tell you a little story from Ecclesiastes, because Solomon addresses that. How many of you ever heard the phrase, that's the ultimate? That's the ultimate. The ultimate cruise is what? Sailing around the world. Can't get any more of a cruise than that. What's the ultimate mountain? I'm going to climb Mount Everest. I worked for ExxonMobil. What's the ultimate? To be the CEO of ExxonMobil, one of the biggest corporations on the planet. That's the ultimate. Solomon in Ecclesiastes, and it's very autobiographical, which means he wrote it about himself. He talks about trying to find the ultimate, and he was well positioned to because he was the king. So he basically talks about all these gardens and these beautiful houses that he built. Okay, ladies, Solomon had the ultimate house. It would be on the front cover of every magazine out there. He had that. Oh, what else did he have? He had the ultimate harem. Okay, men, we know what that means. Okay? Solomon had the ultimate, but you know what he said? At the end of it all, he said it's futility. What did he mean that it's futility? Here's what he meant. He meant, no matter how great it is today, I'm just going to want something else tomorrow. In other words, I calling it, you pour water in a bucket full of holes. No matter how much water you put in that bucket full of holes, the water just runs out. A more practical illustration is this. Okay, we'll see how many honest people there are in this room. How many of you have gluttoned and gorged yourself at Thanksgiving? What happened 24 hours later? I'm hungry. In other words, I had the ultimate feast, but in 24 hours later, it's like it never happened. When I lived in Colorado, you loved to strap on a backpack and vanish into the wilderness for a week. I loved it. Sleep under the stars, blue skies, awesome. But you know what? I was talking to this guy one day, and he had done a lot more hiking than me. And he said, you know what, Jimmy, the bad thing about these trips? I said, no, what could be bad? He said, you always have to go home.
Yeah.
In other words, here's my point. For those who think more is better, the ultimate more will not satisfy you. I don't care what it is. The ultimate garden, the ultimate trip, the ultimate possession, the ultimate car. Solomon makes it clear the problem with human nature is the ultimate does not satisfy for long. So we have two extremes. We have Solomon in the room with us telling us about the ultimate. We have David in the room, Paul in the room with us telling us about whether life is good or bad, God's going to get me through it. There's one more man we need to interview, and I've talked about him before, and you're probably going to be sick of it, but his name is Job. What can Job teach us about contentment? His statement was this: God gives, God takes away. So let's bring all these perspectives together on contentment to see what they're telling us. Paul is telling us this: in my discontentment, God is trying to teach me to be content. Why? He says this: I have learned. I have learned. Paul, who wrote 13 books in the New Testament, which you think he would not have to learn anything, had to learn something that everyone in this room has to learn. We all went through learning to read and write, do we not? How many of you have learned to ride a bicycle? Okay, probably most of you. How many of you have learned to water ski? Maybe some. A lot of you probably have learned a lot of different card games. We learn all kinds of things. Paul said this: I have learned to be content. What's he implying there? There was a time when I wasn't. There's a time when I wasn't. So Paul talks about learning, and he says the secret to this The secret to figuring this out, he says, comes from seeing it God's way. I will see it God's way. Job said this, there's going to be times when God's going to give. There's going to be times when God takes away. What can we extract from that? Remember I said part of contentment is what do you expect? Job would say this, I expect there to be good times and I expect there to be bad ones. In other words, it didn't rattle him. In other words, like most of us, and like maybe the 20-year-old or the 15-year-old, he had lived life long enough to expect those times of things taken away. So Job's expectations were good. Paul was a teachable student. Okay? What about Solomon? Solomon was a realistic person. He was honest enough to say this. This was great while it was happening, but the next day I just had to go back to regular life. In other words, Solomon was real enough to say, even though I spent all this money, enjoyed all this pleasure, one thing I realized, it doesn't last that long. We use a phrase all the time talking about marriage, and that phrase goes like this. Well, the honeymoon's over. The honeymoon's over.
Here's my phrase when people said, how long have you been married? And I meant it. People laughed. I said, 52 years of marital bliss stirs, because you get both. I mean, if you say anything different, to me, you're lying. You're going to get the good, the bad, and the ugly. And
The good, the bad, and the
I
ugly.
was joking, but I really wasn't joking.
No. And Solomon, like you, gave a very realistic assessment of what it was like when you're a man who's at the top of his game. He's the president. He's Hugh Hefner, all rolled into one. And he's honest enough to say, look, guys, that Lamborghini, it's great, but a month after you have it, it's just another car in the garage. The first time you have to pay for a repair job, it's just like that Toyota Camry. I started off the lesson talking about accept your lot in life. And so we've looked at these men and how they battled. Job struggled, and we looked at Job struggling to accept his lot, did we not? We looked at Paul struggling to accept his lot, did he not? Okay? We've looked at Solomon. Solomon's being honest about his lot in life, right? The final chapter on all this, or the climax of this is this. God has given you a course to run. Turn to Hebrews 12. Turn to Hebrews 12. Start reading with me in verse 1, Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Why do I bring this passage in? We talked about accepting your lot in 1 Corinthians 7 in the categories of life. We've talked about these three men who struggled to accept their lot in life. Why Hebrews 12? And it's because of Hebrews 11. Most of you are very familiar with Hebrews 11. What's it about? It's about all these saints in the Old Testament that had different challenges that God providentially put in front of them, or to use the phrase he used here about running your course, running the race. He says, let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. These people in Hebrews 11 had a race that they had to run that God set before them. But here's the deal. Daniel's race was not the same as Moses. Okay? All these people in Hebrews 11, they had different races to run. Abraham's race was not the same as everybody else's. You're familiar with Abraham, okay? All these people, they had different races to run that God put in front of them, okay? And he starts off the passage saying that since we are surrounded by a huge crowd of witnesses, the witnesses that he is referring to the recipients of this letter, are the people in Hebrews 11. And so he's trying to tell these people in Hebrews 12, all these people that lived before you, that are your heroes, they all had their individual races to run. Those races lasted a long time, and that's why he said you have to run with endurance. Here's my question. When you look at what I've said this morning, and let's talk about filters. When you look at the filter of accepting your lot in life, when you look at the filters of these three men that we looked at, Solomon, Job, and Paul, who struggled to accept their lot in life, and now we go to Hebrews 12, and what Hebrews 12 is telling us is when you look at Hebrews 11, we all don't have the same course to run. Richard's course to run might be different than mine. Walt's course to run might be different than mine. Dave's course to run might be different from mine. But Hebrews 12 is telling these Hebrew Christians that you have to look at the course God has given you to run. And then he says you need to run it with endurance, because all of us have been around long enough to know the Christian life is an endurance thing, not a sprint. So what am I trying to say here? I have to look at the station God has put me in life through 1 Corinthians 7. I've got to look at it and realize it's going to be a struggle the way it was for Solomon, for Job, and for Paul. So you remember when I talked about expectations and contentment? I have to expect it to be a struggle, because it was a struggle for these men. And then lastly, in Hebrews 12, I have to look at all these different Christians out there and realize that my course is my course and it's not her course. Our courses are not the same. Okay? All of that gets mixed together here with the issue of accepting your lot. The application of accepting your lot in life is running your course in life. The application of accepting your lot in life is choosing to run the course that God has providentially put in front of you. Job, Paul, and Solomon lived in vastly different circumstances. And then when you look at it, God called those three men to very different ministries. They had very different influences. Okay? So I've got to look in the mirror and say, okay, here's the fundamental idea. It comes to one word. What is unique about you? What is your unique spiritual gift? What is your unique lot in life? What is your unique course? What is unique about you? 1 Corinthians 7 says we all have different lots in life. These three men that we looked at said we're going to struggle with it in different ways. Hebrews 12 says I've got to run with endurance. This lot in life, this course in life, it's going to be a long, drawn-out thing. But Hebrews 12 gives us a little more guidance on running the course that God has put in front of you. He says this, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Let's dive into that phrase a minute, because there's a little bit of a difference there. The weight that slows me down is unique to me. He's not talking about a sin there specifically. It could be something good or bad. We can be tripped up by good things. You remember the parable of the soils and the sower and the seed? Do you remember how The seed, it fell on the rocky ground, and it sprang up quickly, but then it withered. And when you look at why, it was because of the distractions of the world. What's that telling us? That the things that distract you may not be immoral or bad. They may be okay, they may be morally neutral, but they divert your attention. That's what he's talking about here when he's talking about some translations might say the encumbrance or the weight, okay? In other words, because Jimmy is Jimmy, Jimmy has certain encumbrances that hinder him. And if Jimmy's going to be wise, he's got to look in the mirror and figure out what that is. Remember when I told you about I see money as security? There's nothing wrong with saving money. There's certainly nothing wrong with planning a budget. But anything that's good can be overdone. Okay? And so these things that are encumbrances, they may be okay, but the problem is when you try to make it the central truth of your life. That's the encumbrance. But then he goes and he talks about the sin. Now he gets a little more black and white. The sin that so easily trips us up. What's he talking about there? Simple faith. I'm telling you, the struggle of your life is not how bad you are. You know what the main struggle of your life is? Do I believe God is who he says that he is? The struggle of my life is not money. It's not recreation and hobbies. It's not being single or being married. It's not being slave or being free. It's not circumcision or uncircumcision. The struggle of my life is, do I look God in the eyeballs and say, I believe you are exactly who you say you are? Do I truly believe you will do what you have promised to do? In Philippians 4, Paul says, I believe God is who he says he is. That's why Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. R.C. Sproul said it great. The central question is not, do I believe in God? This question is, do I believe God? Do you see the difference? In fact, James says the demons believe and they shudder. In other words, the demons believe in God. The question is, do you believe God? Paul realized this, that secret to being content. He said the secret there is believing God. That's why he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So what does that have to do with contentment? If I've learned anything about contentment, I'm going to ask you if you agree. It's a daily choice. I don't choose to be content for 6 weeks from now. Why? Who knows what my circumstances are going to be? Right? I can't choose to be content in 3 weeks. I can't choose to be content yesterday because yesterday's gone. The only day I can choose contentment is today. It's either a now decision or it's a not at all decision. Paul, when he's talking about I've learned the secret, he realizes this. In good times and bad, I have to choose to trust God every day. That's why he said, I can do all things. Do you see the linkage there? Because that linkage is critical. The secret to contentment is daily dependence. So, in Hebrews 12, you got to ask yourself, and this, I would encourage you to read through Hebrews 11 to link it together. Because Hebrews 11 talks about all these different people. And when you look at those different people, here's what you find. Some of them trusted God, and the Bible says they shut the mouths of lions. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? That sounds pretty victorious, right? But it says some were tortured. Uh-oh. So these people who had the same faith, some had great circumstances, Some had horrible ones. But the Bible says they all had the same faith. What does that mean for us with what I've said today? You remember where Paul said, I can get along with a lot or with a little, good or bad? You remember when Job said God gives and God takes, good or bad? And these people in Hebrews 11, they trusted God, good or bad? What do we see there? I call it the coin toss. Faith is a coin toss. You flip it, and heads you get this, but tails you get that. How does that sit with you? Come on now.
Well, when you go through a pretty major trial, you're going to, as you say, flip that coin. You're either going to keep your focus on Jesus and follow what needs to be done. The path is not going to be easy. Or you can go the other way and just leave Jesus going, where were you?
Yep.
So,
Where were you?
yeah, you're right. In that flipping the coin, it's almost an instant choice that you make right then.
Yes. Like contentment, it's a choice you make at the spot when you're faced with it.
Well, Jim, you were talking before about different courses.
Mm-hmm.
We all have different talents God's given us. We use them, that helps set our course where we're going. But the main thing, David just hit on it, was the end goal of believing in God and Jesus and doing our best to satisfy them. But the way you get there, the way I get there, the way David gets there, could be entirely different. But we've all got to concentrate on that one spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You have to choose to run with endurance. And if endurance implies anything, it implies two things. It's a long haul, not a short haul. Okay? And it implies that it's going to be a repetitious thing. Why do I say repetitious? Because of what I said about contentment. It's a daily choice. It's a repetitive choice. Underneath it all, though, here's where Paul and Job agree. The sovereignty of God. Like these people in Hebrews 11, you know what they all had to wrestle with? The fact that they didn't get to choose it. Paul did not wake up one day like a high schooler and says, I'm going to go to college and major in this. Right? That slave did not wake up one day and say, oh, I think I'll choose slavery. That person who was married to the unbeliever did not wake up one day and say, oh, I can't wait to go marry an unbeliever. Your lot in life, Paul's circumstances, good or bad, Hebrews 11 and all of those people, Job's situation, here's the fundamental question. Did any of them get to choose it? Zero. What they all had in common was that they did not get to choose their course. They did not get to choose any of it except how they were going to see it.
And may I say, I would not have been able to accept the way Terry died, but for the fact that you taught us all about the sovereignty of God. And that particular day, I said, did I like it? Did I want it? No. But it was the sovereignty of God.
Right. You
That
don't.
was it.
No. All of these people in the Bible, show me one in Hebrews 11 that got to make the choice on the course God put in front of them. You're not going to find it. And this is where the rubber meets the road. When God says, Jimmy, open wide, I'm going to give you a dose of castor oil, and you're going to cag. I didn't choose that. And you don't get to choose either. Neither did it, Paul did not get to choose. He did not get to say, okay, I think I'm going to have wealth today, and I think I'll put up with poverty in a couple of years. He didn't get to choose. Job did not wake up that fateful day and say, okay, God, I'm ready to bury 10 kids, bring it on. No, didn't get to choose. Moses on the backside of a desert, 80 years old, happy to be a shepherd in oblivion, just like me in the wilderness. Although I've never owned a sheep. Moses had all he could do was say, either I'm going to go back to Pharaoh or I'm not. He did not get to choose. You do not find anything in the Bible dealing with spiritual gifts. Every one of you have a spiritual gift. You do not find any passage in the Bible where you get to choose our spiritual gift. I don't get to choose my spiritual gift any more than you get to choose your eye color. It's not up to you. The central thread through all of these things that I've said is how will you deal with the sovereignty of God. If you deal with the sovereignty of God well, you know what a byproduct of that is? Contentment. What's the secret of contentment? It's accepting the sovereignty of God. That's the magic bullet, if there is one. The key to contentment is you accept your lot in life because it is an expression of the sovereignty of God in your life. You accept your lot in life because it is a direct expression of the sovereignty of God in your life. That's what made Job and Paul, to me, such a hero. Because they battled that, and it was a battle. I talked about Job. He battled with it for 30-something chapters, remember? Job battled with it. Paul said, I have to learn it. That means Jimmy's going to have to battle it and learn it too. Why does that matter? You remember when I used the word expectations? I need to expect contentment to be a learned battle. I need to expect contentment to be a learned battle. So, every one of you are unique. You have a unique course. Only you, not your spouse, not your children, not the pastor, only you can choose to run your unique course with all those unique things that we've talked about today. But if you choose to accept the battle of contentment, what makes any of you more happier than when you are content? All of us have been around long enough where you can look back and you can say, I was really content at that stage in life. Wasn't it great? Any questions or comments? Let's pray.